Hello and welcome to anyone joining us live or for the recording for today's Chart Chat pop-up. We're experimenting with this short format to give us an opportunity to chat about things as they happen instead of just waiting until our monthly live stream that we always have more content that we could possibly pack in an hour. I'm Amanda Makulec. I am the Executive Director for the Global Data Visualization Society, and I'm one of the co-hosts for Chart Chat. Jeff, you want to give a quick introduction to yourself and joining us today?
Absolutely. Jeff Shaffer here. I am a professor at the University of Cincinnati, where I teach data visualization, descriptive analytics, decision modeling, and some other fun courses. I am the vice president of IT and analytics for a fintech company here in Cincinnati as well, and one of the co-authors of the Big Book of Dashboards.
Lots of different titles and roles that you carry, Jeff. For those of you who might be joining us who aren't part of our normal live streams, we do a monthly live stream called Chart Chat. You can find it on the same YouTube channel or follow us now on LinkedIn Live. I will be live streaming there as well for our upcoming session on the 23rd. We talk about this as being more than just chit chat. It's Chart Chat, where we dive in and talk about interesting charts that are of the moment with things happening around the world, and also dive into things that you might be able to apply in your day-to-day work. So I had flagged on our shared Slack channel that I would be interested in popping up with one of my co-hosts to talk about some of these graphics. As we all saw big headlines in the news around the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank and all of the affiliated different challenges that could pose for our US economy and for the world. It's been interesting to track that as someone who has an economist for a husband who's much more tied up in what's happening in this world. And so for me, this has been curious because I keep going and looking for charts that help me better understand some of the complex financial terms and different things that are happening that might seem less complex to those who are not finance people. And as someone who's watched the pandemic unfold as a public health person, I suddenly feel like I'm being humbled. So it's been interesting watching and seeing how some of these different graphics have been created and where there's been kind of a gap in graphics. I've seen a lot of text narratives and timelines, but even going and pulling a couple examples for today's pop-up, I was surprised that there weren't more graphs and charts talking about what was happening in the world of finance in the world of this bank collapse. I don't know if you saw the same thing, Jeff.
Yeah, I still see things popping up on Twitter, so I don't know if we're done with it. But yeah, I guess in general, I mean, COVID, to be fair, went on forever, right? It just kept going, and so I think it took us a while for the dust to settle, and then we saw the charts, kind of pile out. Where something like this it's kind of a flash in a pan, right? It happens really, really quick. It's like, oh, on Thursday they were open and on Friday they were closed. It was kind of like, okay, well, people haven't had really time to digest and understand what's going on and dissect it all. So I think there'll be more to come in the aftermath, but I agree with you.
I'm curious to see what happens and what that looks like. So Jeff and I both pulled together some charts that we have been looking at that we wanted to chat through today and talk about in terms of what works, what we might have changed or what we might have done differently. And there's been, like Jeff said, some interesting Twitter threads around these too. So let's dive in and look at a couple of these. So this is a circle packing diagram looking at the relative size of Silicon Valley Bank compared to other banks that have closed, highlighting that Silicon Valley Bank is the second largest bank failure of all time. I really like this graphic in part because of its simplicity, and it works well from the perspective of just putting things in context in a small amount of space. You quickly kind of get your eye drawn with the blue over to the Silicon Valley Bank. You see the relative sizing of some of the larger ones that have failed, and it doesn't over-label, trying to label all the smaller dots. And so on a kind of emphasizing the scale or size of Silicon Valley Bank, this felt really successful to me. And as a non-finance person, was something I could quickly kind of look at and see what the pattern was that they were looking for. Jeff, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is a graph I tell my students not to do, right? Right. So when I look at it, I'm like, oh no, a packed bubble. But I look at the title and kind of think about your point, Amanda. I mean, it's a very simple message, right? You're not supposed to get anything else out of this graphic, which is SVB is the second largest bank to fail of all time. And then, presumably it lists all the banks that failed over time, right? So there's no time element to it. You can't make a precise comparison of anything in here. You can't see most of the banks because they can't see the labels and you can't see the numbers. But if I step back and say, did it get the message across that was intended? I'd have to say yes. I mean, it happens to be the second big bubble, only, next to Washington Mutual. So I think, for what it's trying to get across, I think it actually works. So I agree with you. There's obviously better ways to visualize this data if you're trying to dive deeper or get more, information out of it. But since that's all the information we're looking for, I guess, in this instance, then I think it works for what it's telling us.
Well, I think that one of the things that highlighted for me was just how many banks do fail, right? All those tiny dots along, like packed along the edges, is we hear about a lot of these, the big bank failures when they happen, but it's not necessarily headline making news when the smaller banks fail. And I thought the New York Times did a really good job in their one of their first articles they pushed out that popped up on my New York Times app. They were talking about the second biggest bank failure. And they instead decided to add a time element. And I should figure out if I can zoom in on this a bit. But the graphic that they first displayed on the left actually shows that time element. So you have time along that x-axis on the bottom. And then what I found interesting was all the really kind of dense lines that you see near the endpoints of each of these lines shows you the number of very small, tiny banks that fail each year in terms of those years when those failures happened, because they're very close together, little packed lines dividing out the banks themselves. And it has some nice annotation layers here, and I think kind of helps add the time element that you don't get from something like this. In terms of my next question looking at this graphic is, well, when did Washington Mutual fail? I'm not familiar with kind of what that timeline is. And I think this did a nice job doing that, and then also putting Silicon Valley in the broader picture of what was happening within the context of kind of what the size of banks are in the US. You've got these big four sitting here at the top that just ultimately continue to dwarf any of these. It's still large, but smaller banks than those big four. And so I thought this pair of charts together was actually really nice because it gave a lot of interesting and kind of simple, easy to understand context in terms of what that looks like. I did ask the economist's husband what he thought of this one. And one of his comments was that it wasn't immediately apparent what was happening with those, the kind of the density at the top. Because if you're not someone who's familiar with maybe how those are being plotted and recognizing that those are individual lines that make up individual banks, that might be harder to make sense of or understand. But you get the same sense of those kind of really big bank failures, where they happened, and also when they happened, which I liked a lot. So thoughts on this, Jeff?
I love this graphic, but as Steve would say, I'm a professional chart looker at it, right?
Yeah.
So I agree with you. It's complex, right? Now, this is the New York Times, so I think you got a different audience that's probably reading it. You probably have people who are more affluent, with data literacy and reading graphs, right? I think that this is the time series I was talking about, that the bubble chart doesn't have. This puts that in perspective and shows, by the way, that we haven't had a failure like this since the Great Recession. So I think that's interesting. Also interesting, though, is the flip side is I don't know if this one tells me the second biggest bank as quick as the other one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I have a lot more information on the bar chart, but I do have to parse the stacked bar and say, okay, well, Washington Mutual is the tallest stack of that big stack over there, and compare it to the second one. And so that I think that message is interesting. It's there, but it's not quite as to the forefront. But there's a lot of other information on this one, which is what I love about it.
Yeah, it's got a lot of things. And I think that even the bar chart on the right had some really interesting formatting choices. Like you see the pivot from trillion to billion, from the big four to bank number 5, and the change there. And the fact that rather than having an axis along the bottom, you've got this clear, almost table view kind of panning down that you can read. And then you see the relative length of the bars without them being directly labeled. I think a default for a lot of folks is to add those labels on the ends of the bars. But when so many of those bars are so small in scale compared to the big ones, I think the table approach actually works really nicely.
I like that very much. And, it's one of those things. Tableau apparently doesn't believe in trillions of dollars. It stops at billions. So I had to wrestle just to get that in there the way I wanted it, a little custom formatting and all that. But yeah, that's a slick, sophisticated way of doing the scale. And I do like that.
I think it's a nice thing that people can also repeat when they're doing their own work. Like I always think it's interesting to look at these New York Times graphics, and some are more complex, but some things you're like, that's a really thoughtful design decision that I could use. I do a lot more right aligned y axes now after talking to Rosamond from The Economist, I think. So if you look at some of the other charts, I went and looked and poked around at the Financial Times to see what that looked like in terms of what kind of growth looks like. The Financial Times has had a lot more of these more action-oriented titles in terms of what they're trying to tell you in the graphs that they're presenting, which I think is helpful as you're trying to figure out what different graphs mean and what they look like. So this is just looking at kind of what that looks like as the growth in deposits and assets. I don't know if there's a reason in finance why you'd make this into bar charts versus line charts, Jeff. You've got more finance knowledge than I do.
No, I mean, I don't think so one way or the other. I think what they're trying to show is your deposits, right, are your custodial money, and your assets are backing that custodial money, I guess. So I mean, when I look at it, that's what I kind of think of as, okay, well, your depository accounts versus how much assets you're sitting on. I don't mind this either. I like the use of the color. I think works in this. We're going to talk about one that RJ did in a few minutes, but there are other, like a bar in a bar or a bar overlapping a bar, other variations of this. But I think they're trying to compare the gap, I guess. So I get it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, I mean, I look at this and I'm like, so what's a good gap is the question I would ask. And I don't know the answer to that as someone who doesn't really work with financial numbers as much. So in terms of what was an acceptable gap is a question I would have looking at this. And is there kind of a gap that should start to make me concerned? And I don't know that from reading this graphic, which is a little bit tricky. And maybe there isn't something, maybe it's just a statement of fact.
No, I think you're spot on. When we jump to I played with the data a little bit last night, and it's one of the things that I jump to, because then the other thing to think about is your blue bar, your assets. They're not all created equal. You have assets that are more liquid versus assets that aren't, and in this case, when you have a run on a bank, you can't tap into illiquid assets to cover those those deposits. So
yeah. It's that curious question about kind of context and telling me how to read something in terms of more a statement of fact versus how to interpret it. They were very keen on the bar charts here in terms of what things were looking like at the Financial Times. This again is looking at the comparison across all FDIC insured institutions and looking at unrealized gains or losses on investment securities. And so this is where you start to get into things that are words that I think people who read the Financial Times would probably be able to parse and look at this graphic really quickly. And it speaks to the fact that looking at the ways in which people understand information when they are experts in a subject matter, not just expert chart looker-atters, could look at this and know immediately what to expect. I would look at this and say, like, are those the quarterly negative numbers really concerning from the last year? Probably, right? But I don't know how to kind of interpret what the relative changes or scales are there in terms of what that looks like. And I don't think we need to dive into all the nuances and details of kind of how to read financial charts, but I wanted to pull up some examples that focused on kind of the ways in which a paper like the Financial Times was digging into more complex metrics and measures and saying, let's go ahead and dive into the data in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I guess what I would add here, I mean, I feel your pain a bit, Amanda, because during COVID, I was not a health expert, right? So I'm not somebody who understood half those terms and had to skill up a little bit to even understand what some of those charts meant. I think what we have here, especially the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Economist, they do have a sophisticated audience that is probably reading these things and immediately understands the context to which these graphs are in, right? I mean, if you want to tell a simple story about SVB, it's like, oh, it was a run on the bank, right? Like it's as simple as that, right? But there's so many other complexities in that story. And, I think what's starting to come out in some of these graphs is, we're in a rising interest rate environment. Decisions were made when interest rates were 1.75%, and all of a sudden it jumps up. And so when that happens, then you have you have the fallout from that. And if you're on the wrong side of that interest rate, betting it's going up or thinking it's not going to go up as much as it went up, you could put yourself in a situation. I think what's starting to pop in this story, which is what led to my story, this the things I was reading was really, again, about things that are locked up. If you're held to maturity securities, like we think about mortgages, there might be those might be 10-year sort of securities, and so then you're kind of stuck. And I think there's the blog post I was reading was a lot around poor decisioning around what they actually purchased, right? Their assets that they actually held. And so I think that's what this is starting to look at here.
Yeah, and helpful to see kind of more context. And I like the quarterly look. You get really granular data there. I wish it told me it was quarters somewhere on the bottom. I had to interpret that from the fact that there's 4 bars a year, but it does start to dive into a bit more detail. And to your point on kind of simple graphics, I mean, these kind of schematics or graphics or cartoons that popped up, I actually found were actually more comical and more interesting in terms of saying things like this is a domino effect on a run on a bank. So I appreciated some of the ways in which people interpreted it in more layman's terms and what that looked like, to your point on it's a run on a bank and what could the domino effect be. So we saw some funny little graphics that popped up like this. As you look at RJ's story, this is, I think, where this started, right? So this was from also a piece of work that was from a professional chart creator, or at least asset management professional, in terms of someone who writes for JP Morgan's asset management group about these situations and about kind of doing, it looks like a routine update on things that are happening within the broader market. So do you want to kind of talk through what this looks like and some of the conversation that unfolded?
Yeah, this is a PDF that's available. It was JP Morgan's private bank. So there's the Eye on the Market is the title of the PDF. I think it was published March. So not too long ago. It was like March 10th or something. So it wasn't too long ago that this was published. It was referencing data in the chart from this period. So if you open up the PDF, you'll see a lot of similar, we actually will show a couple graphs, but I think this got the attention, this paired bar chart, really kind of showing the difference here. And is RJ's next? I think what RJ did was reimagine it, I guess, redesign it a bit. And I really liked what he did. I think this works really, really well. Basically the same data that you just saw in the previous bar chart, but he does a overlapping bar for the difference between the common equity tier 1 and then this adjusted for unrealized losses. And then, he goes further, right? He puts, I mean, for somebody who doesn't know, right, the tier 1 capital ratio, he spells out what that is, explains what that is. He has the source on there with what this is, and it really kind of spells out, oh, hey, look at SVB compared to everybody else, based on this metric. And that was interesting to me because then it created a thread, which I think was related. He didn't say it was, but at the next slide, he was posting, hey, are there any other formats for comparative bar charts? Here's the 5. Am I missing anything? And I got a sense he was playing around with this based on what he was doing with that other graph. He chose to do the overlapping bar, but you can see here he has sort of a stacked bar in a couple different ways. He has a bar in a bar, and then ultimately the paired bar, which is how the original authors did it. And so I liked his solution, and I really liked his simple design.
Yeah, I think it looks good. And certainly I jump and I see the kind of low number and the SVB piece called out a little bit more specifically. I think the two things that I would have questions for around this, that going back to the original one too, you see that big gap there with the SVB component, but it's not called out as explicitly. But it does, in a really big way, tell me when this is from. This isn't data for kind of current quarter of saying, okay, so this is what happened. Say you look at this as a layperson. Oh, is that just because they had this run on the bank? So that's why that value looks so low or something like that, but rather that it's Q4. So I actually like that the time period is called out really explicitly here. And the other question I have is related back to that kind of what is considered acceptable. Mm-hmm. So are these 5 and 10% numbers that he's chosen along the axis? Like, is that what your target looks like in terms of what you want to see in terms of what that capital ratio needs to be for a bank to be considered to be doing well or in good standing on these measures?
Yeah, and that's a common one we fight with all day, every day in business, right? It's like, okay, well, what I showed the number over time. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it, put it in context? Is it, should it be going up? Should it be going down? Those are all great points. And I think the message, I mean, if you look at what the regulators, right, they were within the tolerance of risk, for any measure. And I think what this is calling out is, but if you adjust it, for the unrealized losses, this is what it looks like. And I think that's the message coming from this.
I think it's really well done in terms of getting a good example of something being very effective in black and white too, where you don't always need a bunch of different colors for different bars. Much as I appreciate the blue colors in the Financial Times graphics, I think this highlights how if you kind of throw something into black and white, you can actually really focus on the shape of the data really nicely, which I think is a great example that RJ did without trying to muddy it with additional colors.
And then the red really pops, right?
And the red really pops out more than,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure, in terms of what that looks like.
Well, then
Um,
Steve Wexler asked,
yep.
he said, well, what if the best way to show the difference isn't a bar, right? That was his response. And I had the same thought. I was like, well, why not make this sort of focus on the gap? The interesting thing, if you go to the next slide, is this is the chart that is in the PDF. So they actually did it as a dot plot. And I don't know, you kind of fight like, okay, well, do you rotate the axis? The next slide, I rotated it just to kind of see like, okay, well, I can now read it a little easier. I didn't clean this whole thing up. But I just wonder if this is a better way to show that gap of, hey, look, there's a really, really big gap, since that's really what you're focusing on. And I think that's what Steve was getting at in his comment. And so then, a connected dot plot, or in this case, just the two dots, maybe, or shading the area. It has SVB shaded, but I was wondering why not just shade the whole thing, right? The whole gap to show, hey, look how big this gap is.
I had the same thought in terms of actually shading in the whole space and what that looks like and being able to actually see the whole row basically by itself. And I personally prefer reading these kind of charts this way, in part just because the labels are easier to read when I'm looking at reading the letters. I always hate having to do the rotated text to the side situation to read what they mean. But I do think that it helps a lot to kind of see that and looking at it that direction, and drawing in the line in some way, even a really light shaded bar between them would really emphasize that difference a bit more. I think you'd better see the differences for the other banks. Like it takes a minute to kind of focus in and be like, well, like TFC down at the bottom looks like it has a kind of what are the next couple largest deltas? And I think that that's a little bit harder to visually track if you wanted to focus in on that component too. It would certainly add more to what the chart itself looks like.
If you go back one, I would just contrast some of the things you liked about RJ's. I think, could work here. The background color of the light yellow, the light blue, I think, distracts in the sense of, it's on your data, but it's not, if the whole thing were one color, I think that would be okay. But I think, just it's focusing in on just the data portion of it. You have these black border around your titles. You have your access in these 1% increments, and then therefore tick lines that cover, each row and each column to create these little squares. I think, if I pull a lesson from RJ, I think you could pull this back a little bit, right? In so many ways that would just focus more on the data story rather than all the other elements that are on this chart that I have to kind of parse through.
I agree with that. I think that's a really good point in terms of just the other various components that are there. In terms of looking at the other graphics that popped up, there were things related to kind of telling the story more effectively. This one is a lot to map through. If you want to just look at it and say like, kind of like that, what is it, that map of like the world of defense contractors? You kind of zoom back and you're like, okay, so what is this telling me? And what I saw in this is complicated. But did you have some other thoughts as you were looking through this on components that you think work well or maybe are helpful for someone if they really dig in and spend time with this chart?
I had the same thought that you did. I was like, wow, that is really, you're telling a lot in this story. I applauded the assets that you see growing, which was told in that other bar chart that you saw. Up at the top on the same timeline, you see the interest rates going up. So you can kind of see that story of like, hey, look, this is a rising interest rate, problem here. And then it tries to break out, it has a bunch of question marks in there, right? It didn't seem to have the answers to a lot of the questions because to be fair, there's still a lot of unknowns as to how it was going to unfold. But I did like, that it was breaking out the components like, hey, $40 billion was withdrawn, right? People withdrawing money. And so that's that subset of the assets. And then, they lost money over here, and that's the loss that they're taking. And then over here, people withdrew more money. And so it was kind of stepping through like, hey, here's the problem, right? The light pink is the run on the bank. The red actually is, the loss that was incurred. And you kind of look at it and you're like, wow, that's a lot of assets for a little bit of loss. and then you kind of see the effect of the bank run. I guess it just wiped out their assets. So you really have to parse this one, but I do applaud the details of it because it really dives into the story more than some of the other charts.
I want more annotations of the lines at the top. Like, I think the lines at the top are what are trying to explain the macroeconomic components of what's happening. And I almost wish there was more annotation. The way they have at the bottom, like people withdraw money, SVB sells. Like, I wish there was a little bit more annotation there, some reference to kind of what is happening with those various different lines at the top. That was one of the things that jumped out to me as I was trying to parse through this. But yeah, it's a lot to try to pack into one space.
Yeah, I mean, as you parse the formula, what they're basically saying is as your interest rate increases, right, your future cash flow gets discounted at a higher rate. I mean, all these things are kind of connected together in this annotation up there. But as the interest rate goes up, then your discount rate in your future cash flow gets higher, makes your present value of your money lower, which then that ties down to the $1.8 billion loss that you have to take as the interest rates, rose. So that's impressive to me. I mean, putting all those pieces together, again, you'd have to be, this isn't going to be for a lay reader to just read and understand, the present value discount cash flow, formula there. But I think, it does show the story, as I tear it apart, it does have the pieces of the story here.
I mean, and you have to appreciate the aesthetics. It's put up on like a pseudo chalkboard, right?
Right.
Like this is like if we were back in class teaching in person and able to go ahead and draw things out on a whiteboard. That's the kind of aesthetic that this group has gone with. And I don't know the Byte Go site or newsletter, so I'm not familiar with kind of what they typically do. But it is an interesting piece.
Yeah.
You had gone ahead and you had pulled some of the data down, Jeff. Did you want to go ahead and talk through some of the things you had looked at when you were kind of parsing your own stories on pieces, and then we might close out with just pulling up that PDF, which is a little bit chart packed with some other components. I know I looked at even just some of they've got some donut and pie charts in there that aren't the worst in the world, but maybe some color changes might help a little bit.
There's a lot of charts in that one. Yeah.
Yeah. But you had gone ahead and pulled up a couple different examples of kind of what you might do with the same data. So you want to talk through this?
Yeah. I mean, as I was reading some blog posts, it's interesting as you unravel. I mean, one of the things that a theme that I've heard, and I don't know if it'll remain true, but so far, everybody talks highly about these people at the bank. Nobody has called them out on fraud or, bad, no negligence, like as far as bad actors, maybe negligence and bad decisions. I've heard people say, hey, you guys, what were you thinking? Why did you do that? But I don't think they did anything nefarious, right? And so that's interesting to me. So then I started, looking deeper. There were some, there were ex-employees complaining about some of those decisions. One of them being, why are we so heavy in mortgage-backed securities? Why were we buying 10-year MBS notes that, are not, that in a rising interest rate environment that you're going to say, well, how much more did you possibly earn by buying those? And what position did it put the bank in? And so that got me thinking. I'm like, okay, well, how much of that did they have? And interesting enough, as small as they weren't tiny, right? But as small compared to somebody like Chase and Bank of America and Wells Fargo, they had a lot of mortgage-backed securities. And in fact, when I look at that, they were the 8th largest portfolio of mortgage-backed securities, which is pretty remarkable compared to the people above it on the list, like Citigroup and Chase and Wells Fargo and Bank of America, a lot more assets. And so then that got me on, well, what is a percentage of assets? How much were they holding of these mortgage-backed securities? And that was really interesting to me, which is like, oh, half of your assets are in these, sort of long-term, low interest. I think I read 1.75% or something on these notes. And, as interest rates rise, that's they're ultimately having to take a loss on these things and basically stuck. And I guess, again, back to the original thing, which is if they're not nefarious, right? They weren't stealing people's money. that's the good news in all this, which I think is why you're not going to see a domino effect, is there's plenty of assets there.
Mhm.
And so the bridge bank that the FDIC puts in place, I mean, Monday morning they said, yep, everybody has access to their money. Everybody will get their money back, not the investors of the stock or the executives, but at least your deposit people are secured. And there's plenty of assets here, right? It's not like there was like in the Great Recession, people were inflating the real estate portfolios, or, the value of the real estate collapsed. In this instance, these loans, I mean, looking at the report from SVB, they have very low charge-offs. Their losses on this portfolio are very small. So I think in the end, the story, I don't want to say it's a non-story. It may be a story of how people, do things in the future. Somebody else wrote, you had a $2 billion loss. Any other bank would have jumped on the plane. I think the quote was, fly to Kuwait and get $2 billion and cover, like sell something, right? Sell some of your bank or whatever. It's like, you could have done that. And I guess my last piece of soapbox, the bank acted in a very, very transparent way. And I wonder, at what point is there too much transparency? Like, did they have to tell everybody everything that was going on minute by minute? Had they just waited 48 hours and done some things a little differently, I'm not sure it would have played out the same way. They might have been able to gap fund, their losses. They might have been able to deal with it in a different way, right? And so I find that interesting. It's an interesting story. At the end of the day, you never know, right? But I think what's interesting here is you look back. This chart to me, I didn't publish this yet because I was still kind of playing around with it, but this was another piece of the story. It was like that RJ chart where it's like, oh, look at SVB compared to everybody else. Now, to your question, what is a good metric, right? Like, maybe is 25 good, or is 10% good? Maybe, maybe they need to be more liquid. Maybe they should have had more treasuries on their book or something. I don't know the answer to that, but I thought this was an interesting look at that portfolio.
I think it's such an interesting question on the kind of real-time information piece. And I saw a couple articles pop up that were focused on some of those same themes around the communications challenge that SVB faced in a world where there's both a lot of political feelings about whether or not you bail out a bank or not, and what that looks like and what that means, and trying to make sense of and explain how this might be different than what was happening in, say, 2008 for some of the reasons you'd highlighted. And the real-time information stream that you had founders and other folks who were flagging up. And I mean, I saw pop-ups as a parent with young kids. I follow different kind of kids' toys companies and stuff saying, we're uncertain about our future. Please go buy our products because we need the money and the cash right now because we don't know if we'll have cash to make payroll on Monday. And I that's not something that was happening in 2008. Like, it was a different era of kind of social media and these different companies and how they might communicate. And I'm curious how some of those communications that I think pulled at heartstrings in ways that in terms of the impact of this bank's closure, if they weren't to be made whole eventually in terms of their deposits, creates an interesting question around how the public sentiment around this entire incident looks as we look back on it, and how that real-time information influenced it. And that's less about data and more about stories, right? Like, it was the threads of the founders being like, I run this company, and then people poking at them in different ways. And I saw some unkind remarks as well. So
yeah, I mean, you're thinking about real-time information. I think this was the first run on a bank, with Twitter, right? And so, I don't know that environment existed before. So again, you have this real-time information as it's unfolding in a much quicker way into people's inbox, right? We haven't had a bank failure in 3 years. And so, especially this size. And then you think about the makeup of the bank, right? Being Silicon Valley Bank, it had all of those startups. And you think about, that systemic risk you were talking about. You look at a Fifth Third, which is headquartered here in Cincinnati. If Peter Thiel writes a letter and says, hey, everybody pull money out of Fifth Third, I don't know that it's going to have the same reaction as SVB, because he had all of those companies, right? It was like all the eggs of the basket were in that SVB basket, right? You had all of those startups in there. And so as soon as you see startups starting to pull those out, those are companies, right? Pulling pulling their cash. So that's a lot. That's a lot of cash. $40 billion, I think I read, that was just wiped out, pulled out. I shouldn't say wiped out, pulled out of their accounts. Where you go to another bank, a more traditional bank, how many consumers would that take, right? That would take a lot of consumers. And then, by the way, consumers are protected up to 250,000, with the FDIC insurance, where, these companies were not. And so that's another part of the equation, right? Like a lot of people don't sit on more than $250,000 worth of cash. So they're probably like, oh, I'll be okay if my bank, right? But these companies could have, like you said, payroll. Well,
I'm not trying to make payroll was going to be my comment there.
Yeah.
It's funny because that was the thing on the charts inside of the PDF. And I did put a link to the PDF in the comments if folks are watching or rewatching this, was actually this kind of mix of looking at what industries and sectors the money was in terms of where that came from. And so they actually do have a donut chart here that was focused on kind of Silicon Valley deposit funding and where that was and the industries it was divided across in terms of their deposits. And I was looking at the notes, and there's a lot of good text narrative in that document, but it focused a lot on this kind of idea that if you look at Silicon Valley, they had this unusually high reliance on corporate and VC funding, the technology stuff, and only a small red private bank slice looks like a traditional retail deposit. And I was like, if you want to use a donut chart here and focus someone's attention on the private bank piece, I really lose that with all of the other stuff going on this chart. And if you were to simplify it out to either kind of group or cluster things, the tech stuff in blue, the life science stuff in green, or just go down to something that's all black and white besides that one segment, that pie chart would just be so much easier for me to see that without having to go back to the text components, which for me was kind of these are kind of a part of the story that I think people can understand in terms of a lot of the assets are tied up in tech. And I think it's an example of where kind of that part to whole piece of what share of the pie is made up of these different industries or where does it sit is an interesting one to look at, and maybe is even more effective if you're looking at it from kind of what is the share of corporate VC versus private bank and what that looks like.
I think you just did this on the fly, didn't you?
I did. I did it this morning, like in 5 minutes before we started, because I was like, this donut chart is really irking me, because I feel like when I was reading through the document, I'm like, why does that not jump out to me more? Because that makes so much sense. It's like, where all that money coming from?
Yeah.
But yeah, that would be how I would look at some of these components, is how do you actually go ahead and make sure that we've got more of a kind of a visual emphasis on the story that you're telling, which can be really helpful in drawing attention, similar to RJ's example with the bar charts and then the red components there and what that looks like. And so if folks do want to jump in and look at that PDF document, there is a lot of narrative information there. I think it's interesting to see kind of what from the narrative actually pops out to me as a professional chart looker at her, I suppose, and the charts themselves. But if folks want to go ahead and dig into that, it does have a lot of different content and context in there to go ahead and dive into for more information from an asset management perspective, which may sound like a scary set of words if you're not a finance person, but I think he writes in a very kind of understandable way, which I appreciated.
If you're trying to make a overlapping bar in Tableau, that's a little tricky. I did a blog post on that. Tableau does not just do overlapping bars really easy. So you got to sort of fake the date a little bit is kind of what we call it. You kind of put it as a fake date and basically plot one bar at the 1st of the month and one bar at the 15th of the month kind of thing. And that's how you get an overlapping bar chart. So I had a blog post from a while back on that, and when I saw RJ's, I thought of it. So I put that in the chat window as well. We can link to that.
Yeah. Would you do it in an enterprise dashboard then? I guess I wouldn't, if it involves that much complexity. Juice worth the squeeze.
If it's dates, it's not that hard to do, and it probably wouldn't be that hard to maintain. So I don't know technically that it's not too much of a hack to worry about. So I wouldn't worry about that. I guess I just ask, is it the right chart type, right? I don't know where this came from, but there was an organization that had this as one of its standards as for charting. And so people were trying to do it to match the standards of this organization. And so that's why I did it. I don't know. I think I would probably not use that chart just because there probably would be other alternatives, but I don't know. RJ may have me rethinking that. I did like RJ's chart. So I might have to think about my use of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it provided a really interesting example of where we kind of might have a use case for those kind of more complex pieces. And if you're just joining the end and taking a peek at that, RJ's chart is this lovely black and white remake with that highlighted SVB component of this overlapping bar and bars, looking at this data differently than what we saw in the original chart that was provided in this Eye on the Market report. So that wraps us up for our quick kind of chart chat shorts. The goal is to keep these short, brief, and a little bit shorter than our hour. But Jeff, thanks for hopping in, popping up, and also helping to kind of demystify and make sense of some of these finance charts for folks. I think it's helpful.
Well, thank you for asking me. I thought it was fun.
Yes, well, we'll see everyone, I hope, on the 23rd and next week. Next week, where is March gone? I feel like
That's
it's
right.
still January. On the 23rd, we've got Spencer Sheen. I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, Jeff. Spencer Sheen?
I think that's right.
Spencer Sheen joining us. He does those beautiful, amazing three-dimensional maps in Ray Shader. So we'll be talking with him about all of his work, and excited to have him joining us as our guest on the 23rd. You can find everything that you need in terms of all things Chart Chat if you're looking for more information on what's coming up, where to register for our next event, anything else related to Chart Chat and these shorts, and related to our monthly live stream on chartchat.live. So you'll be able to see information about that and find information about next episode if you go up here in the corner and click on next episode. So that's where you can go ahead and find the way you can register for Chart Chat Live. So we hope that we see folks next week. Thanks again, Jeff, for hopping on, and have a great rest of your week, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.